Detective Miller wasn't your typical big city cop. He preferred quiet observation to loud chases, and a well-worn book to the flashing lights of a crime scene. He had a knack for seeing what others missed, a talent honed by years of staring at dusty files in the cold case unit. That's where he found himself now, staring at the file of Mrs. Eleanor Davis, a fourth-grade teacher who had vanished without a trace 10 years ago from Oakwood Elementary. The file was thin, almost mocking in its lack of substance. A few witness statements, mostly from bewildered children. A police report detailing a fruitless search of the school grounds. And a handful of photographs, each one more depressing than the last. The initial investigation had been thorough, but ultimately unsuccessful. The case had gone cold, filed away and largely forgotten. Until now. Miller ran a hand through his thinning hair, the fluorescent lights of the office reflecting in his weary eyes. He understood why the case had stalled. There was no body, no clear motive, no smoking gun. Just a missing teacher and a school full of unanswered questions. But something about the case bothered him, a nagging feeling that a crucial detail had been overlooked. He picked up the file again, flipping through the pages. The witness statements were repetitive, filled with the vague recollections of children. She was smiling, one child had said. She had a blue dress on, another remembered. She was nice, a third offered. Nothing concrete, nothing that could lead to a suspect. The police report detailed the search, every classroom, every closet, every corner of the school had been combed. The surrounding woods had been searched, the nearby river dragged. Nothing. It was as if Mrs. Davis had simply vanished into thin air. Then there were the photographs. Pictures of Mrs. Davis, smiling and vibrant, a stark contrast to the grim reality of her disappearance. Pictures of the school, eerily empty. And then, the blurry school photo. It was a snapshot taken during a school event on the day Mrs. Davis disappeared. A group of children were gathered around a table, their faces bright with excitement. In the background, barely visible, was the trophy cabinet, its glass doors reflecting the chaotic scene. The photo was out of focus, the details obscured by motion blur and poor lighting. It had been dismissed as irrelevant during the initial investigation. Just another blurry photograph. But Miller couldn't shake the feeling that the answer to Mrs. Davis's disappearance was hidden somewhere in that photo. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the image. It was a long shot, he knew, but he had nothing else to go on. He decided to send the photo to the forensics lab, hoping that the new technology they had could somehow sharpen the image and reveal what was hidden in the shadows. It was a gamble, but in the world of cold cases, sometimes a gamble was all you had. He knew that this blurry photo was the best chance he had to bring justice to Mrs. Davis and her family. The detective tapped his pen against the worn surface of his desk, the rhythm a steady counterpoint to the silence of the office. While he waited for the forensics report, Miller decided to delve deeper into the original investigation. He pulled out the transcripts of the interviews conducted with the students and staff of Oakwood Elementary. He reread the accounts of Mrs. Davis's colleagues. They described her as a dedicated teacher, loved by her students and respected by her peers. She was organized, punctual, and always willing to lend a helping hand. None of them could imagine why anyone would want to harm her. There were no reports of arguments, no signs of stress, no indication that she was unhappy or afraid. The students' accounts were more fragmented, colored by the innocence and limited understanding of children. They spoke of Mrs. Davis's kindness, her patience, and her ability to make learning fun. They remembered her reading stories, helping them with their math problems, and organizing games during recess. They missed her terribly. One student, a little girl named Lily, had drawn a picture of Mrs. Davis surrounded by smiling flowers. On the back of the drawing, she had written, "I hope you come back soon, Mrs. Davis. We all miss you." Miller felt a pang of sadness as he looked at the drawing, a stark reminder of the human cost of this unsolved mystery. He also reviewed the background checks on all the school staff. Everyone had a clean record, no history of violence or criminal activity. Except for one minor incident involving Mr. Johnson, the school janitor. Years ago, he had been arrested for a petty theft, shoplifting a bottle of liquor from a local store. The charges had been dropped, and the incident seemed insignificant. But Miller made a mental note to look into it further. The hours ticked by slowly, each one filled with the relentless pursuit of a cold case. Miller knew that the odds were stacked against him. 10 years had passed, memories had faded, and evidence had likely been lost or destroyed. But he refused to give up. He owed it to Mrs. Davis, to her family, and to the community to find out what had happened to her. Finally, the phone rang, breaking the silence of the office. It was the forensics lab. They had enhanced the blurry photo. Miller's heart pounded in his chest as he listened to the technician's report. The enhancement had revealed a figure standing near the trophy cabinet, partially obscured by shadows. It was impossible to identify the person with certainty, but the technician believed it was a man. And, crucially, they had managed to isolate a partial fingerprint from the surface of the trophy cabinet in the enhanced image. It was faint and smudged, but it was there. Miller felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it, the break he had been waiting for. The blurry photo, once dismissed as irrelevant, had yielded a crucial piece of evidence. A fingerprint. He instructed the technician to run the fingerprint through the database, hoping for a match. He had a feeling that they were about to uncover the truth about Mrs. Davis's disappearance. The pieces were starting to fall into place. The news from the forensics lab electrified Miller. A fingerprint, after all this time. It was a tangible piece of evidence, a thread he could finally pull on. He paced his small office, the anticipation building with each step. He imagined the technician hunched over a computer screen, comparing the fingerprint to the millions of records in the national database. It could take hours, even days, but Miller couldn't wait. He needed to know now. He grabbed his coat and headed out of the office, the crisp autumn air a welcome change from the stale atmosphere inside. He decided to drive to Oakwood Elementary, the scene of the crime. He needed to see the school again, to walk the halls where Mrs. Davis had taught, to stand in front of the trophy cabinet and imagine what had happened on that fateful day. The school looked different than it had in the photographs. The trees were taller, the playground equipment newer, and the building itself had been renovated. But the trophy cabinet was still there, standing in the same spot in the main hallway. It was a large, ornate piece of furniture, filled with gleaming trophies and dusty plaques. Miller stared at the cabinet, his mind racing. He tried to picture the scene on the day Mrs. Davis disappeared. The school event was a celebration of the school's anniversary, a day filled with games, music, and laughter. Mrs. Davis had been in charge of organizing the event, and she had been running around all day, making sure everything went smoothly. According to the witness statements, she had been seen talking to Mr. Johnson, the school janitor, near the trophy cabinet. They had been discussing something, but no one could remember what. It was a brief conversation, and no one had thought anything of it at the time. But now, with the discovery of the fingerprint, that conversation took on a new significance. Miller reached out and touched the glass door of the trophy cabinet, his fingers tracing the outline of the fingerprint. It was faint, almost invisible, but he knew it was there. It was a silent witness to a crime that had gone unsolved for too long. He walked around the cabinet, examining it from every angle. He noticed that the base of the largest trophy was slightly askew, as if it had been moved recently. He knelt down and peered at the base, his eyes scanning for any signs of tampering. He saw nothing unusual, just dust and cobwebs. He stood up and stepped back, his gaze sweeping across the hallway. He tried to imagine what had happened to Mrs. Davis after her conversation with Mr. Johnson. Had she been lured away? Had she been attacked? Had she been killed? The questions swirled in his mind, unanswered and unsettling. He knew that the fingerprint was the key to unlocking the truth, but he also knew that it was only the beginning. He still had a long way to go before he could solve this case. As he stood there, lost in thought, his phone rang again. It was the forensics lab. They had a match. Miller's heart leaped into his throat. He took a deep breath and answered the phone. The voice on the other end was calm and professional. "Detective Miller," the technician said, "we have a match on the fingerprint. It belongs to a Mr. Arthur Johnson." Miller felt a chill run down his spine. Arthur Johnson. The school janitor. The man who had been seen talking to Mrs. Davis near the trophy cabinet on the day she disappeared. The man with a minor criminal record. The man who was now the prime suspect in a 10-year-old cold case. The blurry photo had done its job. The truth was about to be revealed. The revelation that Arthur Johnson's fingerprint was on the trophy cabinet sent a jolt through Miller. The janitor. A man who had access to every corner of the school, a man who was often overlooked and ignored. A man with a petty theft in his past. Was he capable of something more sinister? Miller returned to his office, his mind buzzing with possibilities. He pulled up Arthur Johnson's file, rereading the details of his background check. He had worked at Oakwood Elementary for 15 years, starting as a part-time custodian and eventually working his way up to head janitor. He was known for being quiet and reliable, always willing to go the extra mile to keep the school clean and tidy. But there was also a darker side to Johnson, a hint of resentment and bitterness that had been noted in some of the employee evaluations. He was described as being socially awkward, uncomfortable around children, and prone to mood swings. He had also been disciplined on a few occasions for being late to work and for neglecting his duties. Miller focused on Johnson's alibi for the day Mrs. Davis disappeared. According to the original police report, Johnson had claimed to be working in the school's boiler room at the time of the disappearance. He said he had been repairing a faulty valve and hadn't seen Mrs. Davis that day. However, the police had never been able to verify Johnson's alibi. The boiler room was located in the basement of the school, far away from the main hallway where Mrs. Davis had last been seen. There were no witnesses who could confirm that Johnson had been in the boiler room at the time of the disappearance. Miller decided to pay a visit to Johnson's former supervisor, Mr. Henderson, who had retired from Oakwood Elementary a few years ago. He tracked Henderson down to a small town a few hours away and drove out to meet him. Henderson was an elderly man with a kind face and a sharp memory. He remembered Arthur Johnson well. Arthur was a good worker, most of the time, Henderson said. But he had his problems. He was a loner, always kept to himself. And he had a temper. I saw him blow up a few times, usually over something small. Miller asked Henderson about Johnson's alibi for the day Mrs. Davis disappeared. Henderson frowned. I don't remember him working in the boiler room that day, he said. I usually checked in on him in the morning, to give him his assignments. I don't recall seeing him down there. Miller pressed Henderson further, asking if he was certain. Henderson thought for a moment, then nodded. Yes, I'm sure, he said. If Arthur had been working in the boiler room that day, I would have seen him. I would have remembered. Miller thanked Henderson for his time and drove back to his office, his mind racing. Johnson's alibi was crumbling. He had lied to the police. He had been near the trophy cabinet on the day Mrs. Davis disappeared. His fingerprint was on the cabinet. And now, his alibi had been debunked. The evidence was mounting against Arthur Johnson. Miller knew he had to bring him in for questioning. It was time to find out what really happened to Mrs. Eleanor Davis. The blurry photo had started it all, and now, the case was on the verge of being solved. Detective Miller felt the weight of the 10-year-old mystery pressing down on him. He needed to proceed carefully. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. He contacted the local police department and requested their assistance in bringing Arthur Johnson in for questioning. 2 uniformed officers arrived at Miller's office, their presence adding a sense of urgency to the situation. They were briefed on the case and instructed to locate Johnson and bring him in for questioning. Miller decided to wait at the office, reviewing the evidence and preparing for the interrogation. Hours passed, filled with nervous anticipation. Finally, the phone rang. It was one of the officers. They had located Arthur Johnson at his home and were bringing him to the station. Miller took a deep breath and prepared himself for the confrontation. Johnson arrived at the station looking disheveled and confused. He was a small, wiry man with a nervous demeanor and darting eyes. He was led into the interrogation room and seated across from Miller. "Mr. Johnson," Miller began, his voice calm and steady, "we need to ask you some questions about the disappearance of Mrs. Eleanor Davis." Johnson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I already told the police everything I know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't have anything to do with Mrs. Davis's disappearance." "We know that you were working at Oakwood Elementary on the day Mrs. Davis disappeared," Miller said. "We also know that you spoke to her near the trophy cabinet." Johnson's eyes widened slightly. "I don't remember," he stammered. "It was a long time ago." "We have a fingerprint, Mr. Johnson," Miller said, his voice growing firmer. "Your fingerprint. It was found on the trophy cabinet." Johnson's face paled. He remained silent for a moment, his eyes darting around the room. I don't know how my fingerprint got there," he said finally. "I cleaned the trophy cabinet all the time. It must have been from that." "We also know that your alibi for that day is false, Mr. Johnson," Miller said. "Your former supervisor, Mr. Henderson, has confirmed that you were not working in the boiler room at the time of Mrs. Davis's disappearance." Johnson's composure crumbled. He began to sweat profusely, his hands trembling. I don't know what to say," he mumbled. Miller leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Johnson's eyes. "Tell us the truth, Mr. Johnson," he said. "Tell us what happened to Mrs. Davis." Johnson hesitated, his face contorted with fear and guilt. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. He looked at Miller, then at the two officers standing behind him. He knew he was trapped. "Okay," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "I'll tell you everything." He then began to recount the events of that day, his words spilling out in a torrent of confession. He described how he and Mrs. Davis had argued near the trophy cabinet, how the argument had escalated, and how he had accidentally killed her in a fit of rage. Miller listened intently, his mind racing. Johnson's confession was a major breakthrough, but he knew that it was only the beginning. They still needed to find Mrs. Davis's body. And they still needed to find the weapon that Johnson had used to kill her. The trophy cabinet was the key. He asked Johnson where the weapon was. Johnson told him he hid it in the base of the largest trophy. "All right, Mr. Johnson," Miller said. "Let's go to Oakwood Elementary." The squad car pulled up to Oakwood Elementary, the flashing lights casting an eerie glow on the school building. It was late, and the school was deserted, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets. Miller led Johnson out of the car, his hands cuffed behind his back. Johnson shuffled along, his head bowed in shame. They entered the school, the familiar scent of floor wax and old books filling the air. Miller led Johnson to the main hallway, where the trophy cabinet stood like a silent sentinel. He shone his flashlight on the cabinet, illuminating the gleaming trophies and dusty plaques. "Show us where you hid the weapon, Mr. Johnson," Miller said, his voice firm. Johnson hesitated, then pointed to the largest trophy, a towering silver cup that commemorated the school's state championship in basketball. "It's in the base," he mumbled. Miller approached the trophy cabinet and knelt down, examining the base of the trophy. It was made of heavy wood, covered in a layer of felt. He ran his fingers along the edge of the base, feeling for any sign of an opening. He noticed that the felt was slightly loose in one corner. He carefully peeled back the felt, revealing a small compartment. Inside the compartment, he saw something wrapped in an old cloth. He reached into the compartment and pulled out the object. It was a small crowbar, its metal surface stained with what appeared to be dried blood. Miller's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the weapon that had been used to kill Mrs. Davis. He held up the crowbar, his eyes fixed on Johnson. "Is this it, Mr. Johnson?" he asked. "Is this the weapon you used to kill Mrs. Davis?" Johnson nodded, his face buried in his hands. Yes, he sobbed. That's it. I didn't mean to do it. It was an accident. Miller carefully placed the crowbar in an evidence bag, his mind racing. They had found the weapon, they had Johnson's confession, and they had a clear motive. The case was finally closed. He looked at Johnson, his face filled with a mixture of anger and pity. "Where is her body, Mr. Johnson?" he asked. "Where did you hide Mrs. Davis's body?" Johnson hesitated, then pointed towards the back of the school. "I buried her in the woods," he said. "Near the old oak tree." Miller signaled to the other officers, and they led Johnson out of the school and towards the woods. As they walked, Miller couldn't help but think about Mrs. Davis. She had been a beloved teacher, a kind and gentle woman who had dedicated her life to helping children. Her life had been tragically cut short, and her killer had gone unpunished for 10 long years. But now, thanks to a blurry photo and a determined detective, justice was finally being served. The truth had been revealed, and Mrs. Davis could finally rest in peace. The crowbar was the final piece of the puzzle. All that was left now was to find Mrs. Davis's body and bring her home. The long nightmare was finally over. The officers led Johnson through the darkness towards the woods behind Oakwood Elementary. The beam of their flashlights cut through the trees, illuminating the path ahead. Miller followed close behind, his mind focused on the task at hand. He knew that finding Mrs. Davis's body was crucial, not only for the sake of her family but also for the legal proceedings that would follow. They reached the edge of the woods and began to trek deeper into the trees. The ground was uneven and covered in fallen leaves, making the going difficult. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying vegetation. After a few minutes of searching, Johnson stopped in front of a large oak tree, its branches gnarled and twisted like ancient fingers. "It's here," he said, his voice trembling. "I buried her here." Miller directed the officers to begin digging. They retrieved shovels from the trunk of the squad car and began to excavate the ground beneath the oak tree. The work was slow and arduous, the soil heavy and compacted. As they dug deeper, the officers uncovered a layer of decaying leaves and branches. And then, they hit something solid. They carefully cleared away the debris, revealing a piece of old fabric. Miller approached the gravesite, his heart pounding in his chest. He knelt down and examined the fabric. It was a piece of blue cloth, the same color as the dress that Mrs. Davis had been wearing on the day she disappeared. He signaled to the officers to continue digging. They carefully removed the remaining soil, revealing a shallow grave. And then, they saw it. A skeleton, its bones bleached white by the passage of time. Miller felt a wave of sadness wash over him. He had found Mrs. Davis's body, but it was a grim and tragic discovery. He had brought closure to her family, but at a terrible cost. The officers carefully removed the remains from the grave and placed them in a body bag. Miller stood by silently, his head bowed in respect. He knew that Mrs. Davis's long journey was finally over. As the officers carried the body bag back towards the school, Miller lingered behind, gazing up at the old oak tree. He thought about Mrs. Davis, about her life, and about her tragic death. He wondered what had motivated Arthur Johnson to kill her, what had driven him to commit such a heinous crime. He knew that he would never fully understand the darkness that lurked inside Johnson's heart. But he also knew that he had done his job. He had solved the case, he had brought justice to Mrs. Davis, and he had brought peace to her family. He turned and walked back towards the school, his footsteps echoing through the silent woods. The blurry photo had led him on a long and difficult journey, but it had ultimately led him to the truth. And that was all that mattered. The sun began to rise, casting a golden glow over Oakwood Elementary. A new day was dawning, a day of healing and hope. The nightmare was finally over. The legal process moved swiftly after the discovery of Mrs. Davis's body and Johnson's confession. The district attorney, initially hesitant to pursue a cold case with limited evidence, now had a solid case with a confession, the murder weapon, and the victim's remains. Arthur Johnson was formally charged with murder in the second degree. The trial was a somber affair, the courtroom filled with Mrs. Davis's family, friends, and former students. They listened intently as the prosecution presented its case, laying out the evidence that had been gathered over the past few weeks. Detective Miller took the stand, recounting his investigation from beginning to end. He described how he had re-examined the blurry photo, how he had discovered the fingerprint, how he had tracked down Arthur Johnson, and how he had ultimately obtained his confession. He testified about Johnson's demeanor during the interrogation, his initial denials, and his eventual breakdown. He described the moment when Johnson had revealed the location of the murder weapon and the burial site. The defense attorney attempted to discredit Miller's testimony, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and that Johnson's confession had been coerced. He pointed out that there were no witnesses to the murder and that the physical evidence was limited. However, the prosecution presented a compelling case, highlighting the inconsistencies in Johnson's alibi and the overwhelming evidence that linked him to the crime. They called Mr. Henderson, Johnson's former supervisor, to testify about Johnson's alibi. Henderson reiterated his statement that he did not recall Johnson working in the boiler room on the day of Mrs. Davis's disappearance. The prosecution also presented expert testimony from the forensics lab, confirming that the bloodstains on the crowbar matched Mrs. Davis's DNA. They also presented evidence that Johnson had a history of anger management issues and had been disciplined for his behavior in the past. After several days of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, everyone waiting anxiously for the verdict. Hours passed, and the tension grew thicker with each passing minute. Finally, the jury returned. The foreman stood and announced the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Arthur Johnson, guilty of murder in the second degree." A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Mrs. Davis's family erupted in tears, their faces a mixture of relief and sorrow. Justice had finally been served. Arthur Johnson stood silently, his face expressionless. He was led away in handcuffs, his fate sealed. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, paying the price for his heinous crime. Detective Miller watched as Johnson was led away, his heart filled with a sense of satisfaction. He had solved the case, he had brought justice to Mrs. Davis, and he had brought closure to her family. The blurry photo had been the key, the catalyst that had unlocked the truth. And now, the long nightmare was finally over. He knew Mrs. Davis would finally rest in peace. Years passed. Arthur Johnson remained in prison, a forgotten figure in the annals of crime. Oakwood Elementary continued to operate, its halls echoing with the laughter and chatter of new generations of students. Mrs. Davis's memory lived on in the hearts of those who had known her, a testament to her kindness and dedication. Detective Miller retired from the police force, his career marked by numerous solved cases and a reputation for unwavering dedication. He often thought about the Mrs. Davis case, the case that had defined his career. He kept the enhanced photo on his desk, a reminder of the power of perseverance and the importance of never giving up. One day, a young girl named Emily came across the story of Mrs. Davis's disappearance while researching local history for a school project. She was fascinated by the case and decided to visit Oakwood Elementary to learn more. She spoke to the school principal, who told her about Mrs. Davis and about the detective who had solved the case. She also showed Emily the trophy cabinet, the place where it all had happened. Emily stared at the trophy cabinet, her imagination running wild. She pictured Mrs. Davis and Mr. Johnson arguing, the tension escalating, the tragic outcome. She wondered what had led to the argument, what had caused Mr. Johnson to snap. She noticed the largest trophy, the one that commemorated the school's state championship in basketball. She examined the base of the trophy, just as Detective Miller had done years before. She noticed that the felt was slightly loose in one corner. Curiosity piqued, Emily carefully peeled back the felt, revealing a small compartment. Inside the compartment, she saw something wrapped in an old cloth. She hesitated for a moment, then reached into the compartment and pulled out the object. It was a small, tarnished silver locket, its surface engraved with the initials E.D. Emily's eyes widened in surprise. She recognized the initials. They were Mrs. Davis's initials. She opened the locket, revealing two tiny photographs. One was a picture of Mrs. Davis, smiling and radiant. The other was a picture of a young man, his face filled with love and admiration. Emily realized that the locket must have belonged to Mrs. Davis. It was a personal item, something that she would have cherished. It was a piece of her life that had been lost for 10 long years. Emily took the locket to the school principal, who was equally surprised by the discovery. They contacted Detective Miller, who was overjoyed to hear the news. Miller met Emily at Oakwood Elementary, his eyes filled with gratitude. He took the locket from her hand, his fingers tracing the initials, E.D. He knew that this locket was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of Mrs. Davis's life, a reminder of her love and her legacy. He thanked Emily for her discovery, telling her that she had brought a piece of closure to the case. He promised to return the locket to Mrs. Davis's family, so that they could finally have a tangible piece of her to remember her by. As Miller walked away from Oakwood Elementary, he couldn't help but smile. The blurry photo had solved the case, but it was Emily's curiosity and determination that had brought a final piece of closure to the story. The memory of Mrs. Davis would live on forever, a reminder of the importance of kindness, compassion, and the enduring power of the human spirit. The case was truly closed. Forever. Detective Miller sat on his porch swing, the cool evening air rustling through the leaves of the old oak tree in his front yard. He held Mrs. Davis's locket in his hand, its tarnished silver surface reflecting the dim light. He had returned it to her family earlier that day, and they had been overwhelmed with emotion. They had thanked him profusely, telling him that the locket was a precious reminder of their beloved mother and sister. He opened the locket, revealing the two tiny photographs. He gazed at the picture of Mrs. Davis, her smile radiant and warm. He wondered what she would have thought of the events that had unfolded, the discovery of the locket, the closure that it had brought. He then looked at the picture of the young man, his face filled with love and admiration. He wondered who he was, what his relationship to Mrs. Davis had been. He decided to do some research, to try to find out more about the man in the photograph. He went inside and sat down at his computer. He typed Mrs. Davis's name into the search engine, along with the words Oakwood Elementary and missing person. He scrolled through the search results, looking for any clues that might shed light on the identity of the young man in the photograph. He came across an old newspaper article about Mrs. Davis's disappearance. The article mentioned that she had been engaged to be married to a man named David Thompson. Miller typed David Thompson's name into the search engine, along with the words Oakwood Elementary and Mrs. Davis. He found a Facebook page for a David Thompson who lived in a nearby town. He clicked on the Facebook page and scrolled through the photos. He recognized the man in the photos. It was the same man who was in the photograph in Mrs. Davis's locket. Miller reached out to David Thompson, sending him a message explaining who he was and why he was contacting him. Thompson responded almost immediately, expressing his surprise and gratitude. They arranged to meet the following day. Miller drove to Thompson's house, his heart filled with anticipation. He was eager to learn more about Mrs. Davis and about her relationship with Thompson. Thompson was a kind and gentle man, his eyes filled with a quiet sadness. He told Miller about his relationship with Mrs. Davis, how they had met, how they had fallen in love, and how they had been planning to get married. He said that Mrs. Davis's disappearance had been devastating for him. He had never given up hope that she would be found, but as the years passed, his hope had dwindled. Miller showed Thompson the locket and the photograph. Thompson's eyes filled with tears. He said that he had given Mrs. Davis the locket as a gift, a symbol of their love. He told Miller that he had always suspected that Arthur Johnson was responsible for Mrs. Davis's disappearance. He said that Johnson had always been jealous of his relationship with Mrs. Davis. Thompson thanked Miller for solving the case and for bringing closure to his long nightmare. He said that he would never forget Mrs. Davis and that he would always cherish the memories that they had shared. As Miller drove home, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had not only solved the case, but he had also brought comfort to David Thompson, a man who had loved Mrs. Davis deeply. The blurry photo had led him on a long and difficult journey, but it had ultimately led him to a place of healing and hope. The story of Mrs. Davis would live on, a reminder of the power of love and the importance of justice. And for Detective Miller, it was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always light to be found. The case was finally, truly, completely closed. The town of Oakwood held a memorial service for Mrs. Eleanor Davis, 10 years after her disappearance. The service was held at Oakwood Elementary, the place where she had dedicated her life to teaching. The school's gymnasium was filled with people, all gathered to honor her memory. Detective Miller sat in the front row, alongside Mrs. Davis's family and David Thompson. He listened as the speakers shared stories about Mrs. Davis, her kindness, her compassion, and her unwavering dedication to her students. One of the speakers was Emily, the young girl who had discovered Mrs. Davis's locket. She spoke about how fascinated she had been by the case and how determined she had been to learn more about Mrs. Davis. She said that finding the locket had been a surreal experience, a moment that she would never forget. She spoke about Mrs. Davis's legacy, her impact on the lives of her students, and the importance of remembering her for the good that she had done. David Thompson also spoke at the memorial service. He shared his memories of Mrs. Davis, his voice filled with emotion. He spoke about their love for each other, their plans for the future, and the devastating impact that her disappearance had had on his life. He thanked Detective Miller for solving the case and for bringing him closure after 10 long years of uncertainty. He said that he would never forget Mrs. Davis and that she would always hold a special place in his heart. As the memorial service drew to a close, a group of students released a flock of white doves into the sky. The doves soared upwards, circling above the school before flying off into the distance. Miller watched the doves disappear, his heart filled with a sense of peace. He had solved the case, he had brought justice to Mrs. Davis, and he had brought closure to her family and friends. But he knew that the memory of Mrs. Davis would live on, a reminder of the importance of kindness, compassion, and the enduring power of the human spirit. After the memorial service, Miller visited Mrs. Davis's gravesite. He stood in silence for a moment, paying his respects. He placed a single white rose on her grave, a symbol of his gratitude and admiration. He knew that Mrs. Davis could finally rest in peace. Her story had been told, her life had been honored, and her memory would live on forever. As he walked away from the gravesite, Miller felt a sense of closure wash over him. The blurry photo had led him on a long and difficult journey, but it had ultimately led him to a place of healing and hope. The case was finally, truly, completely, and irrevocably closed. And Detective Miller knew that he had done everything that he could to bring justice to Mrs. Davis and to honor her memory. Her legacy would live on, inspiring future generations to be kind, compassionate, and to never give up on the pursuit of justice. The end. This story has already included the confrontation and confession, so this section will focus on a different aspect, the impact on the school and community. The solving of the Mrs. Davis case rippled through the town of Oakwood, leaving a mix of relief and sorrow in its wake. For the students and staff at Oakwood Elementary, the revelation of what happened to their beloved teacher was both shocking and cathartic. The school held an assembly to explain the situation to the students, carefully tailoring the information to their age groups. Counselors were on hand to provide support and guidance, helping the children process their emotions. Many of the students had never known Mrs. Davis, but they felt a connection to her through the stories they had heard and the legacy she had left behind. They learned about her kindness, her compassion, and her dedication to teaching. They also learned about the importance of justice and the power of perseverance. The teachers at Oakwood Elementary were deeply affected by the news. Many of them had worked alongside Mrs. Davis for years, and they had cherished her friendship and her guidance. They remembered her as a bright and cheerful presence in the school, a mentor and a role model. They struggled to understand how Arthur Johnson, a man who had been a part of the school community for so long, could have committed such a heinous act. They grappled with feelings of anger, sadness, and disbelief. The school principal, Mrs. Thompson, no relation to David Thompson, played a crucial role in helping the school community heal. She organized counseling sessions for the students and staff, and she worked tirelessly to create a supportive and understanding environment. She also established a scholarship fund in Mrs. Davis's name, to honor her memory and to provide financial assistance to deserving students. The scholarship fund quickly gained momentum, with donations pouring in from all corners of the community. The town of Oakwood rallied around Oakwood Elementary, offering support and encouragement. Local businesses donated supplies and equipment, and volunteers offered their time to help with various school projects. The community organized a Day of Remembrance to honor Mrs. Davis's life and legacy. The event included a memorial service, a tree planting ceremony, and a community picnic. Hundreds of people attended, united in their grief and their determination to remember Mrs. Davis for the good that she had done. The solving of the Mrs. Davis case had brought closure to the community, but it had also left a void that could never be filled. Mrs. Davis was gone, but her memory would live on, inspiring future generations to be kind, compassionate, and to never give up on the pursuit of justice. The school, the town, and the people who knew her were forever changed by the events that had unfolded, but they were determined to move forward, to honor her memory, and to build a better future. The blurry photo had revealed the truth, but it was the community's response that truly defined the legacy of Mrs. Eleanor Davis. The story of Mrs. Eleanor Davis and Detective Miller became a local legend in Oakwood. The blurry photo, once dismissed as a useless piece of evidence, was now a symbol of hope and perseverance. It was a reminder that even the smallest detail could hold the key to solving the most complex mysteries. Oakwood Elementary created a Mrs. Davis Day each year, a day dedicated to celebrating her life and legacy. The students learned about her contributions to the school and the community, and they participated in activities that promoted kindness, compassion, and justice. The scholarship fund in Mrs. Davis's name continued to grow, providing opportunities for countless students to pursue their dreams. The recipients of the scholarship were encouraged to embody Mrs. Davis's values and to make a positive impact on the world. Detective Miller became a frequent visitor to Oakwood Elementary, sharing his story with the students and inspiring them to never give up on their goals. He talked about the importance of perseverance, the power of technology, and the value of community. He often reflected on the Mrs. Davis case, recognizing it as the defining moment of his career. He had solved other cases, but none had touched him so deeply. He had brought justice to a woman who had been wronged, and he had brought closure to a community that had been grieving for far too long. He knew that the case had changed him, making him more compassionate, more determined, and more grateful for the opportunity to serve and protect. He had learned that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope, and that even the smallest act of kindness can make a difference. The story of Mrs. Davis and Detective Miller served as a powerful lesson for the students of Oakwood Elementary. They learned that anything is possible if you have the courage to believe, the determination to persevere, and the support of a community that cares. And so, the legacy of Mrs. Eleanor Davis lived on, not only in the hearts of those who had known her, but also in the minds of future generations, inspiring them to be the best versions of themselves and to make the world a better place. The blurry photo, once a symbol of mystery and uncertainty, had become a symbol of hope, justice, and the enduring power of the human spirit. The end. And her memory lived on. The end.